she wanted to sell her late father's old barn. But when she lifted the rotten floorboards, she understood why he had kept the door locked all this time. Look what she found under the barn. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning after the funeral broke gray and hesitant, as if the light itself was uncertain it wanted to return. Emily Carver stood on the cracked porch of her father's house, her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders, the cool wind carrying with it the scent of the river and old wood. The house, once alive with voices and the steady rhythm of her father's tools, seemed smaller now. The paint had peeled away from the shutters, the steps sagged beneath her weight, and the mailbox leaned like a weary man who had been waiting too long for a letter that would never come. She had not been home for years, not really. Her visits had grown shorter as her life in the city stretched further from this quiet place, until she stopped coming altogether, calling instead, pretending that phone calls could replace presence. But standing there again, with the dust still heavy from the footsteps of mourners, she felt the weight of everything she had left behind. Inside, the air was dry, faintly tinged with coffee and the ghost of tobacco. The clock above the mantel had stopped, the pendulum caught mid-swing. On the table by the window sat a single folded piece of paper, the lawyer's schedule for that morning. At noon, they would all gather to read her father's will. She had been dreading that moment since the funeral ended, when her brother Richard clapped her on the shoulder and said, "Don't expect much, Em. You know how he was." There had been something cold in his voice, a hardness she'd grown used to. Richard had stayed behind when she left years ago, taking over the practical side of the family, the business, the land, the day-to-day routines that had once filled their father's life. He'd always called her the dreamer, as if that were a weakness. By the time the lawyer arrived, the small living room had filled with the murmurs of family. Richard was there, in a pressed shirt that didn't quite hide the soil still embedded in his hands. Their Uncle Neil, round-faced and sharp-eyed, sipped coffee and whispered to Martha, their cousin, whose bright red nails tapped impatiently against her glass. They spoke in low tones, the kind that carried just enough for Emily to hear her name. She sat quietly near the window, tracing her finger along the grain of the table, waiting for the inevitable. The lawyer was a small man with thinning hair and the practiced calm of someone who had delivered far too many final verdicts on lives that weren't his. He unfolded the papers, cleared his throat, and began. By the last will and testament of Harold Carver, dated March 3rd, all possessions are to be divided as follows. His voice had the steady rhythm of someone reciting a familiar prayer. To his son, Richard Carver, he leaves the family home and the adjoining acreage. Richard's jaw tightened, though a hint of satisfaction crossed his face. To his niece, Martha Green, he leaves his savings account and the remaining bonds in his name. Martha smiled thinly, pretending surprise. To his brother, Neil Carver, he leaves the 1968 Chevrolet truck. Neil laughed softly. About time that thing got off his hands, he muttered, earning a few chuckles from the others. The lawyer paused then, his gaze lifting from the page. To his daughter, Emily Carver, he leaves the barn located on the southern edge of County Road 14. The silence that followed was almost delicate at first, then cracked apart with laughter. Martha tried to stifle hers behind her hand, but couldn't. Richard leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. The barn? That old wreck? Guess he thought you'd like the rats and dust, Em. Uncle Neil grinned, raising his cup. Maybe it's full of treasure, he said, voice dripping with mock sympathy. Or ghosts. Emily's face didn't change. She had learned long ago how to wear stillness like armor. She simply nodded, murmured a polite thank you to the lawyer, though her voice came out hollow, more reflex than speech. The meeting ended quickly after that. Papers were signed, hands were shaken, and in less than an hour, her father's life was divided into a few sheets of paper and some laughter. When everyone had gone, the silence in the house pressed in like fog. Emily walked through the rooms slowly, touching the furniture, as if to reassure herself it was real. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the bread her father used to bake on Sundays. His chair by the window remained where he'd always left it, the cushion permanently indented by his weight. On the counter, beside a stack of unpaid bills, she found a small notebook bound with a worn leather strap. The cover was marked with stains and scratches, but inside, the handwriting was careful, deliberate. Her father's hand, steady even in old age. Most of the pages were filled with lists, measurements, notes about repairs on the property, reminders of crops that had long since stopped growing. But at the very end, written in a fading line of ink, was a single sentence. Some doors aren't meant to stay closed forever. She sat at the table for a long time, staring at those words. They stirred something deep in her, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even defiance. As a child, she had always wanted to follow her father when he worked in the fields or disappeared into the barn for hours. He'd smile at her, rough hand brushing her hair, and say, "Not today, Emmy. Some places have to wait for their time." Then he'd lock the barn door and walk away, leaving her to wonder what he did inside. Eventually, she stopped asking. Now, years later, that locked door came back to her vividly, sharper than any memory she had of him at the end. She tried to picture the barn as it was then, the red paint, bright in the sunlight, the smell of hay and oil, the whir of grasshoppers in the tall grass around it. She couldn't remember when it had started to fade, when the paint began to peel and the laughter stopped coming from that direction. She only knew that one day it had stood silent, and her father never spoke of it again. That night, she barely slept. The house groaned with the weight of wind and time, and each sound seemed to call her name. When she closed her eyes, she saw the outline of the barn against the horizon, its roof sagging like a bowed head. She imagined herself walking through the overgrown path toward it, hearing the crunch of gravel underfoot, feeling the cool handle of the door beneath her palm. The thought filled her with both dread and longing. In the morning, she woke before dawn. The world outside was still dark, the sky only beginning to turn pale. She brewed coffee in her father's old percolator, its hiss and pop a familiar rhythm that steadied her. The decision had already been made somewhere in the space between dreams and waking. She would go to the barn. She didn't know why, perhaps to see what was left, perhaps to understand what her father had meant by his strange bequest. But she couldn't ignore the pull any longer. She found the keys hanging from a hook by the door, the same ones that had been there since she was a child. One of them, small and iron, was marked with a faded tag that read simply, "Barn." She held it for a moment in her palm, cold and heavy, as if it carried not just metal, but meaning. The road to the barn was the same narrow strip of gravel that had cut through their land for generations. Grass pushed up between the stones, and the fence posts leaned with age. The sky had cleared now. A pale wash of blue stretched thin over the hills. As she walked, the sound of her boots against the dirt seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. No cars, no voices, only the hum of insects and the whisper of wind through dry weeds. When she reached the rise that overlooked the southern fields, she saw it. The barn stood at the edge of the horizon, its roof patched with rust, its walls faded to a ghost of the red it once was. Time had stripped it of pride, but not of presence. It looked wounded, but stubbornly alive. Emily stopped and took a long breath. She thought of her father again, how his shoulders had stooped in his final years, how his hands had trembled when he tried to lift a cup, and yet his eyes had always held a quiet determination. Maybe he had been like this barn, weathered, but unbroken. She walked closer until the scent of old hay and dust reached her. The lock on the door was corroded, the metal flaking under her touch. She turned the key slowly, and for a moment thought it wouldn't move. But then there was a soft click. The sound startled her with its finality. She didn't open the door. Not yet. The sun was setting behind her, casting long shadows across the ground. The barn loomed before her, patient and silent, as if waiting for her to step inside. She realized she wasn't ready. Not tonight. The air was cooling, the crickets beginning to sing, and she felt suddenly small beneath the weight of that waiting darkness. She turned back toward the house, the key still in her hand. Behind her, the barn stood against the fading light, a silhouette carved out of memory. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow, I'll open it. As she walked back, the wind picked up, stirring the dry grass. For a moment, she thought she heard something. An echo, a whisper, maybe just the sigh of the old boards shifting with the breeze. But it sounded almost like a voice. Her father's, low and certain, as it had been when she was little. She paused, turned, and looked once more toward the barn. The light had nearly gone now, and in the dimness, its shadow seemed to stretch farther than before, reaching toward her. When she finally reached the porch, night had fully fallen. She set the key on the table beside the lamp and sat for a long time without lighting it. The dark around her felt less like emptiness and more like anticipation, the kind that hums softly just before something begins. She thought again of the will, the laughter, the careless dismissal in her brother's voice. They believed she had been left with nothing. Perhaps they were right. Or perhaps, she thought, as the wind brushed against the windows, her father had given her something far heavier than any of them could carry. A secret, sealed beneath years of dust, waiting for her to find the courage to face it. She rose, finally, and went to bed, the key still gleaming faintly under the moonlight that filtered through the window. Sleep did not come easily. Her mind wandered through memories of hay-scented afternoons and her father's quiet whistle as he worked. In that half-dreaming haze, she could almost hear it again, coming from the direction of the barn, steady and patient as always. By morning, she knew she would go back. She would push open the door and step inside, into whatever waited beyond the dust and silence. And though she did not yet understand it, her father's words echoed like a promise in her mind. Some doors aren't meant to stay closed forever. It was a thought that lingered as the first light crept across the fields, touching the roof of the barn until it glowed faintly, like an ember stirring back to life. The next morning came gray and thin, the kind of light that hesitates before breaking through the clouds. Emily awoke to the sound of rain tapping softly against the kitchen window. It wasn't a steady rain, just a misting drizzle that dampened the world and left the air heavy with the scent of earth and wet leaves. She sat at the old wooden table, wrapped in her father's flannel shirt, a cup of coffee cooling beside her. The key to the barn lay where she had left it the night before, its iron surface catching the dim light. She turned it between her fingers, feeling the weight of it, the roughness of the edges worn smooth from years of use. It was a small thing, but it seemed to carry the gravity of 1,000 unspoken words. She finished her coffee, pulled on her boots, and stepped outside. The rain had stopped, though the ground still glistened. Her father's property stretched out in muted shades of brown and green, framed by the distant line of woods. It felt larger than she remembered, as if grief had stretched the land itself. The road to the barn was narrow and overgrown, and her boots sank slightly into the soft soil as she walked. The silence was total, broken only by the faint creak of her leather jacket and the rustle of wind through the brittle grass. When she reached the barn, it stood as it had the night before, weathered, solemn, and still. A faint fog clung to the ground around it, and from a distance, the old building looked almost spectral, like something left over from another lifetime. The red paint had faded into a dull rust color. The boards, though sturdy, were streaked with dark stains where water had run down during storms. It wasn't beautiful, but it had presence, the kind that demanded quiet respect. She paused in front of the door, the key cold in her hand. For a moment, she thought about turning back. What if there was nothing there, just dust, cobwebs, and the remains of old equipment? What if the words in her father's notebook had meant nothing at all? But then she remembered the sound she thought she'd heard last night, the echo of a whistle that belonged only to him, and she knew she couldn't walk away. The lock turned easily this time. The hinges groaned in protest as she pushed the heavy wooden doors open, their long, unused creak breaking the stillness. The air that spilled out was thick and stale, filled with the scent of hay, wood, and something metallic underneath. For a few seconds, she didn't move. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, where thin shafts of light pierced through gaps in the roof, illuminating floating particles of dust that shimmered like tiny ghosts. Inside, everything was layered in time. There were the remains of tools, a rusted plow leaning against the far wall, coils of rope hanging like forgotten vines. The ground was carpeted in straw that had long since turned gray. Against one wall stood a workbench, and above it a row of shelves filled with jars and nails, each coated in the same thin film of years. It wasn't the barn she remembered from childhood. Then it had been bright and orderly, filled with the smell of hay and oil, her father's voice humming low as he worked. Now it was a tomb of labor, sealed in silence. She set her flashlight on and began to walk slowly through the space. Her footsteps stirred the dust into soft clouds that made her cough. On the floor near the workbench, she found a cracked wooden crate filled with small objects, nuts, bolts, broken glass, a pair of gloves stiff with age. She turned one over in her hand, remembering how her father used to keep everything, insisting that even the smallest thing might come in handy one day. He had said it so often that it had become a kind of family proverb. On a low shelf beneath the bench, she found a folded cloth, dry and brittle, with something written on the corner in her father's handwriting. She brushed away the dust. The words were faint, nearly illegible, but she could make out, "Don't throw away what you don't understand." The phrase made her pause. It wasn't the kind of thing he'd ever said aloud, yet it sounded exactly like him, practical, and somehow deeper than it seemed. The light from her flashlight caught something glinting beneath a pile of old straw in the corner. She moved closer and knelt down. There was a strange bulge in the floorboards, an uneven patch that didn't match the rest. As she cleared away the straw, she uncovered a small metal ring embedded in the wood. It was rusted and dark, almost invisible at first glance. She tugged at it gently, but it didn't move. She pulled harder, bracing her foot against the floor, until finally, it lifted with a reluctant creak. The sound echoed through the barn, sharp and hollow, like a breath after long silence. Beneath the ring, a square section of wood lifted slightly, a hidden hatch. The edges were sealed with years of dust, but the shape was unmistakable. Her pulse quickened as she knelt and brushed the dirt away. The wood was cold to the touch. She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly. Her father had been meticulous about his work. If he had hidden something here, it wasn't by accident. It took effort to pry the hatch open. When it finally gave, the hinges let out a groan that seemed to vibrate through her bones. A rush of cold air escaped from below, smelling of damp soil and iron. She lifted the door fully and shone her flashlight down into the opening. There was a narrow wooden ladder leading into darkness. For a long time, she didn't move. Her first thought was to close it again, to pretend she hadn't seen it. She had come only to look, to understand a little more about her father, not to crawl into some hidden hole beneath his barn. But curiosity, once woken, doesn't go back to sleep. She crouched at the edge, testing the first rung with her foot. It held. Slowly, carefully, she descended. The air grew colder with each step. The walls were close, the smell of soil stronger. When she reached the bottom, her boot sank slightly into packed earth. She turned the flashlight slowly, and the beam caught the outline of a small underground room. The walls were lined with rough boards, the ceiling low enough that she had to duck slightly. Along one side stood shelves stacked neatly with boxes and folders, their edges yellowed with time. On the other side was a wooden table, and above it, a single metal lamp hung from a wire. Emily set down her flashlight and found a matchbox resting beside the lamp. Her hands trembled as she struck one and lit the wick. The lamp flickered to life, filling the space with a warm, trembling glow. The shadows danced along the walls, revealing more of the room. It wasn't chaos, it was order. Everything was arranged deliberately, carefully. Whoever had worked here had done so with purpose. She opened one of the boxes. Inside were papers, old and dry but still legible. Deeds, land surveys, letters. She picked up the topmost page and held it to the light. It was dated June 1965, and the handwriting was unmistakably her father's. In the margins, he had written notes, short, precise, as if tracking something. A few of the pages bore names she didn't recognize, though some stirred vague memories of neighbors from her childhood. She moved to the next box, then the next. They were all the same, organized, labeled, preserved. It was as if her father had built an archive beneath his own land. But why? He had never been a scholar or a collector. He was a farmer, a man who valued simple work and quiet evenings. And yet here was a hidden room filled with documents, as though he'd been guarding something. Her gaze drifted to the far wall, where a large map was tacked up, corners curling slightly. She stepped closer. It was a map of the county, hand-drawn and marked with dozens of red crosses and circles. Each one had a name written beside it: Jenkins, Carter, Owens, Reed. The names sent a chill through her. Many of them belonged to families who had disappeared from the area when she was young, their houses sold or burned, their farms turned into empty fields. She touched one of the marks lightly, tracing it with her finger. There was something both meticulous and desperate in the way it was drawn. Her father had been keeping track of what, she didn't yet know. A faint noise startled her, the soft creak of the boards above, as if the barn itself had shifted. She froze, listening. Nothing followed. Only the slow drip of water somewhere in the dark. Still, she felt a tremor of unease. This place was not meant to be disturbed. But she couldn't stop now. She moved back to the table and noticed a small object, half hidden beneath a pile of papers. A tin box, sealed with a simple clasp. Inside it, wrapped in wax paper, was a collection of black and white photographs. She held them up one by one, old images of farms, houses, men standing beside tractors, women holding children. Each was labeled in neat handwriting on the back. Reed Farm, before sale. Owens property, winter of '68. The faces looked solemn, uncertain, unaware that they were being preserved for something larger than their own small stories. Her eyes fell on one photo near the bottom of the stack. It showed her father standing in front of this very barn, years younger, his hair dark and thick, his face set in a half-smile. Beside him stood another man, tall, wearing a suit, unfamiliar. Behind them, the barn door was open, and for a moment, She thought she could see the faint outline of this very hatch, slightly ajar. She set the photo down carefully. Her heart beat faster now. Whatever her father had been doing here, it wasn't simple nostalgia. It was something deliberate, perhaps dangerous. The lamp flickered, and she realized how late it had grown. The world above her felt distant, unreachable. She took one last look around the boxes, the map, the lamp that hummed faintly in the silence, and then she climbed the ladder back to the surface. When she emerged, the air felt brighter, the barn less oppressive. She closed the hatch gently, brushing stray straw over it, as though tucking the secret back to sleep. The sunlight was slipping through the cracks now, painting the dust in gold. She stood for a long time in that light, listening to the faint hum of wind against the walls, her thoughts tumbling and restless. By the time she stepped outside, the rain had returned, light and cold. She pulled her jacket tighter and looked once more at the barn. It seemed different now, not merely old, but alive with meaning. Her father's presence lingered there, not as memory, but as intention. As she walked back toward the house, she turned the words from his notebook over in her mind. Some doors aren't meant to stay closed forever. Now she understood what he had meant. He hadn't been talking about regret or forgiveness or even death. He had been talking about truth and the courage to open it. And though she didn't yet know the full shape of what she had found beneath the dust, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her father had hidden this place for a reason, and that reason was waiting for her to uncover it. The next few days passed in a blur of restlessness. Emily could not stop thinking about what she had seen beneath the barn, the map, the names, the boxes of papers, and above all, the careful order of it all. It was too intentional to be a mere collection of old documents. Her father, she now realized, had built that secret room for a purpose, not to hide junk, but to protect something. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that map with its red crosses bleeding across the county, each one representing a story buried in silence. The air of the house seemed heavier now, as though the walls themselves had absorbed her unease. At night, she lay awake listening to the wind press against the windows, her father's words echoing in her mind. Some doors aren't meant to stay closed forever. On the third morning, unable to endure the stillness any longer, she returned to the barn. The sun was just rising, brushing the fields with a pale gold light that did nothing to soften the chill in the air. Her breath came out in small clouds as she approached the building. The key turned easily, and the smell of hay and earth enveloped her again, familiar now, but still unsettling. She crossed the floor, brushed away the straw, and opened the hatch. The ladder creaked as she descended, the wooden rungs cold under her hands. The air in the underground room was cool and dry. The lamp still hung where she had left it, its wick burned low. She lit it again, the soft glow chasing away the darkness. The place looked exactly as before, yet she sensed something different. Perhaps it was only her understanding that had changed. She moved to the table and began examining the boxes more closely. One was filled entirely with legal documents, deeds of sale, purchase agreements, and tax records, some dating back nearly 70 years. Many bore the same company name, stamped in fading ink at the top Northway Development. She didn't recognize it at first, but after a few minutes, the memory surfaced. When she was a child, there had been talk in town about a construction firm buying up farmland to build factories and housing tracts. Her father had called it the beginning of the end and had refused to sell. She traced her fingers over the company's logo on one of the documents, feeling the faint embossing. Each of these papers told a story, families who had sold under pressure, farms that had vanished overnight, people whose names she remembered from school who had suddenly moved away without explanation. She pulled another folder closer, its label written in her father's steady hand. Carson Family 1971. Inside were letters, pleas, petitions, court notices, all neatly arranged, some bearing her father's notes in the margins. One line caught her attention. False appraisal. Investigate county board decision. It dawned on her that her father had not only collected these papers, but had been actively researching the injustices behind them. He had been documenting corruption. The deeper she read, the more the picture formed. The company had bribed officials to undervalue properties, forcing farmers to sell for a fraction of their worth. When some resisted, accidents followed. Fires, mysterious break-ins, missing documents. The pattern was unmistakable. Her father must have discovered it decades ago and spent his life gathering evidence, quietly, methodically, never telling anyone. In the corner of the table lay a small envelope with her name written across it. The handwriting was unmistakably his, though slightly shakier than before. She hesitated, her pulse quickening, then tore it open. Inside was a folded letter, the ink faded but still legible. Emily, it began, if you're reading this, it means I didn't have time to explain. You'll find what I couldn't bring to light. These papers are more than memories. They are debts unpaid. I spent my life trying to protect those who couldn't fight back. I wanted to speak, but fear and time kept me silent. Maybe you'll be braver than I was. Remember, truth isn't buried forever. It waits. She read the words twice, the paper trembling in her hands. Her father had carried this burden alone, never asking for help, never hinting at what he was doing. All those nights when she'd heard him leave the house, thinking he was walking off his grief or working late, he had been down here, sorting through the sins of others. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. For the first time in years, she felt his presence not as a memory, but as a force, steady, guiding, patient. The sound of tires crunching on gravel startled her. She froze, listening. The engine cut off, and through the cracks in the barn floor, she caught the faint rhythm of footsteps. Someone was outside. For a heartbeat, she couldn't move. The thought of being caught down here, of anyone else discovering this place, filled her with panic. She doused the lamp and climbed the ladder quickly, every step loud in the silence. When she pushed open the hatch, she found her brother standing in the doorway, hands on his hips, eyes narrowed. "So it's true," Richard said. "You really can't leave anything alone, can you?" His tone was sharp, but there was something else behind it. Unease, perhaps even fear. Emily brushed the dust from her clothes and met his gaze. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "I could say the same to you," he shot back. "People are talking him. They say you're digging up old junk, trying to make Dad out to be some kind of hero. You're going to embarrass all of us." Embarrass? She felt a spark of anger flare through her. He was trying to protect people. He kept records proof of what they did. You knew he spent nights out here. Did you ever ask why? Richard's face tightened. I asked. He told me to mind my own business. So I did. Because I trusted him. And because I thought he'd lost his mind. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. Do you know what it'll look like if you start waving those papers around now? Half the town's families have ties to that company. You'll drag everyone through the mud. They already buried enough truth in it, she said, her voice low but steady. He didn't build that room for nothing, Richard. He built it for me to find. Her brother stopped pacing and looked at her for a long moment. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the faint groan of the barn's old beams. Then he shook his head. You always had to turn everything into some crusade, he said softly, almost sadly. Just let it go, Em. He's gone. Let him rest. But she couldn't. She watched him leave, his footsteps fading into the distance until the engine of his truck started and disappeared down the road. The stillness that followed felt heavier than before. She leaned against the wall, breathing slowly, the dust thick in the air. He didn't understand, maybe he never would. But she knew now that silence was the very thing her father had fought against. That night, she returned to the barn again, driven by a mix of grief and determination. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the roof. Inside, the air was dry, the smell of dust almost comforting. She lit the lamp once more and sat at the table, her father's letter beside her. She began sorting through the paper systematically, photographing each one with her phone, making digital copies in case something happened. The lamp's light flickered across the walls as she worked, casting her shadow over the map, merging her presence with his. As the hours passed, the silence took on a strange intimacy. She could almost hear her father's voice guiding her, reminding her to label things properly, to note every date. Each discovery brought new clarity, letters to local officials that had never been mailed, drafts of articles he had tried to write, witness statements signed but never filed. He had done everything alone, fearing what might happen if anyone knew. Sometime past midnight, she came across a folded newspaper clipping wedged between two folders. It was from the local press, dated 30 years ago. The headline read, "Tragic fire destroys Coleman farmhouse, no survivors." She remembered that fire. She had been a child then. Everyone had said it was an accident, a lantern tipped over, nothing more. But written in her father's hand across the edge of the clipping were the words, "Not accidental. Same week Northway purchase approved." Her stomach tightened. It was one thing to suspect corruption. It was another to realize that people had died for it. The wind howled outside, and the lamp's flame flickered. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to absorb it all. The scale of what her father had uncovered was overwhelming. This wasn't a few bad deals. It was a pattern of deceit and violence that had spanned decades, and now she was the only one who knew. By dawn, she could no longer sit still. She gathered several folders into her bag, locked the hatch behind her, and stepped out into the morning. The air was sharp and cold, the horizon streaked with light. She drove to town, her hands tight on the steering wheel. She didn't have a clear plan, only the conviction that someone needed to see what she had found. At the county library, she asked for the local historian, a quiet man named Walter Hensley, who had known her father. When she explained what she had discovered, he listened in silence, his eyes widening as she laid the papers out across the table. "Good Lord," he whispered after a long pause. "Harold was working on this all these years? I thought he'd given up after the first lawsuits failed." "He didn't give up," Emily said softly. "He just went underground." They spent hours going through the documents together. Walter confirmed many of the names, remembering families who had been forced out, farms that had disappeared. He promised to contact a journalist he knew in the city, someone who might be able to help verify the evidence. Before she left, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "But be careful. These are powerful names you're stirring up." When Emily returned home, the fields were bathed in late afternoon light. The barn stood waiting, silent and steady as ever. She parked the car and looked out across the land that had once been her father's world. The wind brushed through the tall grass, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and memory. She knew now that there was no turning back. Her father had left her the barn, not as an inheritance, but as a responsibility, a burden wrapped in truth. The weight of it settled on her shoulders, heavy yet strangely freeing. She could almost feel him there beside her, watching with quiet approval as she took the first steps toward finishing what he had started. That night, as the stars gathered above the dark roof of the barn, Emily stood at the doorway and whispered into the wind, "I won't let it. Stay buried." The night answered with silence, but in that silence, she felt a pulse of something alive. Hope, maybe, or faith. Whatever it was, it carried her forward into what would come next. The morning after her meeting with Walter arrived clear and bright, the kind of morning that felt almost dishonest in its cheerfulness. Emily woke with the uneasy mix of exhaustion and clarity that comes after a long night of decision. The files she had shown him now sat neatly stacked on her kitchen table, their corners weighted by a coffee mug as if to keep them from escaping. She could still hear Walter's voice echoing in her head. "Be careful. These are powerful names you're stirring up." It wasn't a warning she could ignore. The town was already humming with quiet speculation, and she knew that before long, people would come asking questions. But for the first time since her father's death, she felt something like purpose, a line connecting past and present, grief and truth. She dressed simply and drove back to the barn. The gravel road crunched beneath the tires, each familiar sound grounding her. The fields stretched wide and empty on either side, gold and gray in the cool light. When she stepped out of the car, the air was still. The barn looked different now, not as a ruin, but as something steady, holding the last work of a man who had believed too much in fairness to let it die with him. She walked inside, brushing her fingers along the wood as if greeting it. The faint smell of hay, dust, and oil felt comforting, almost human. She pulled open the hatch and descended into the room below. Everything was as she had left it, though she could swear the air felt lighter somehow. She lit the lamp again and set to work, arranging the paper she planned to hand over to the archivists Walter had contacted. Each folder, each sheet, was a fragment of a truth that had been stolen, and she found herself handling them with reverence. Her father's handwriting, neat and deliberate, guided her like a voice across time. She imagined him sitting at this same table years ago, night after night, piecing together the puzzle that no one wanted solved. Outside, the wind began to rise, rattling the barn's boards. She thought she heard a car approach and tensed, but when she climbed the ladder and pushed the hatch open, there was no one. Only the sound of rustling grass and the distant cry of a bird. She stood there for a moment, letting the sunlight spill through the open doors. Dust motes drifted in the beams, turning the air into something almost sacred. By noon, she drove back to town, the folders neatly tied together in the passenger seat. She delivered them to Walter and the county historian's office, where a small team of volunteers had begun cataloging her father's work. They would digitize the documents, preserve them, make them public. The thought both comforted and frightened her. Once the truth left her hands, it would no longer belong to her. It would belong to everyone. When she returned home, she found a letter wedged in the crack of her front door. It was unsigned, written in hurried script. "Stop what you're doing. Some things are better left buried." She read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on the kitchen counter beside the key to the barn. Her heart beat faster, but she didn't feel fear so much as inevitability. It confirmed what she already knew. The truth she carried mattered enough to unsettle the living. The next days blurred together. The local paper ran its first article about her discovery, followed by a second, longer one, from a regional journalist who had driven down after hearing about the teacher who unearthed a hidden archive of corruption. The photographs showed her father's barn, its weathered boards gleaming in the sunlight like the ribs of some ancient creature. People began to stop her in the grocery store, some to thank her, others to whisper that she should have left well enough alone. Old neighbors visited, bringing stories of families who had vanished and names that matched those on her father's map. And then one afternoon, when the sky was heavy with the scent of rain, Richard came back. He stood in the doorway looking older, The sharpness in his features softened. She hadn't seen him since their argument. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, he stepped forward, holding out an envelope. "They're talking about Dad in town," he said quietly. For once, they're saying his name with respect. Emily took the envelope. Inside was a clipping from the paper. The headline simple: "Local man's hidden records. Expose decades-old fraud." Beneath it was a photograph of their father, younger, smiling slightly, the barn behind him. "You did this," Richard said. He'd be proud. His voice cracked on the last word. They sat together on the porch as the first drops of rain began to fall. The silence between them was no longer hostile. It was full of things they didn't need to say aloud. When he finally stood to leave, he turned at the door and said, "If you're going to keep the barn, make it something good." She nodded, understanding. In the following weeks, she poured herself into the restoration. The community, hesitant at first, began to help. The local carpenter replaced the broken beams. High school students painted the outer walls. Walter donated a set of display cases for the documents. Emily worked quietly among them, directing the repairs with the same care her father once gave to his fields. By late autumn, the barn stood renewed. It didn't look young again, but it looked honest, its weathered boards and patched roof holding their history without shame. On the day of the reopening, the sky was clear and cold. People from the town gathered, their breath visible in the air. A small sign hung above the door: "The Harold Carver Archive, in memory of those who were never heard." Inside, the lamplight flickered over the documents displayed behind glass, the photographs, the map with its red crosses. Emily stood by the entrance, greeting visitors, listening as they whispered the names on the walls like prayers. When the crowd thinned, she stepped outside and looked across the fields. The horizon was washed in gold, the sun sinking low. The wind carried the smell of hay and rain, and for the first time in years, she felt at peace. The past no longer felt like a weight, pressing her down, but like soil rich enough to grow something new. As twilight deepened, she walked back inside the barn one last time. The lamp's glow touched the old beams, and for a moment she could almost see him there, her father, sitting at the table, writing, the corners of his mouth turned in that quiet smile he rarely showed in life. She stood there in the stillness, letting the memory hold her. When she finally turned to leave, she paused at the doorway. The last light of day streamed through the cracks in the wood, painting bright lines across the floor. It was as if the barn itself was breathing, exhaling the secrets it had kept for so long. She reached out and touched the wall, feeling its warmth under her palm. "Now everyone knows," she whispered. "It's not hidden anymore." The sun dipped below the hills, and the barn glowed softly in the fading light. From a distance, it looked almost new again, not because time had erased its scars, but because truth had made them part of its beauty. The wind moved through the open fields, scattering the last of the dust, carrying with it the faint echo of her father's voice, steady, certain, alive in the silence he had left behind. Emily stood there until the first stars appeared, the night gathering gently around her. She knew that tomorrow she would come back, as she always had, not out of obligation, but out of belonging. This was no longer a place of loss. It was a place of light, of memory, of truth. And as she closed the door behind her, the golden cracks of the setting sun faded into darkness, leaving the barn standing firm against the wind. A quiet monument to a man who believed that even in dust and silence, the light would always find its way through. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the next ones. Watch more stories on the channel and share this video with someone who loves a good story.